So I will turn this time over to you with that introduction.
Thank you. Good morning, all of you. Oh, we pray. Do you want to say a prayer? Thank you, Lord God, for a beautiful day today. And guide us by your Spirit as we talk about things that really matter to us. I pray in the name of the Lord Jesus. Amen. I'm not exactly sure how I got the assignment to take the chapter that begins on page 55, Adventist and Abortion, what Dr. Provancha refers to as a Christian look at therapeutic abortion. But that is my assignment, and what I want to do in our very few minutes together today is to set that essay of Dr. Provancha's in a kind of historical context. Why did it occur and when it did? I have some thoughts on that. And then, how did it play out? What difference did that make? And finally, third part, what difference should it make today? So, does that make sense?
Yes.
We'll talk about how it came into being, and what difference it made at the time, and what you think of it now going forward. So there's this new book, and my apologies to Dave Larson. David, it says edited by you, and I'm sorry, I got cut off, but David Larson has produced a new book of Dr. Provancha's essays, and it's available on Amazon for a very nominal price, and so I recommend that you go there and get a copy. I guess many of you already have a copy, and maybe that's been supplied here in the Sabbath School. Those of us who knew Dr. Provancha can almost hear his voice in these essays. Many of these were prepared as talks, and he had this wonderful speaking voice, which most of us should envy. And when I read these, I can remember him giving those talks. So it's really been a treat to come back to this set of ideas that Dr. Larson has made available to us now. And we'll get back to Dr. Provancha's thinking about abortion, but I wanted to take just a moment, there are about 3 minutes here, to have us visualize what happens during gestation. Now, there are many healthcare professionals who know this intimately here, but millions of people have seen this imaging that came forward from Alexander Tsitsaris from Yale University. It's a TED Talk. I wonder how many of you have seen this. You don't know. Good. Well, take a look and we'll see if I can get this to work. talk, the title of it is From Conception to Birth, Alexander Tsaras, trying to say the name, from Yale University. All of it done with imaging that they developed at their shop. Much of it computer assisted, obviously. Anyway, I thought it would be useful to focus our attention on what's happening in human gestation by just having that as the opening. When the psalmist speaks of being knit together in the mother's womb, it gives us an image that vivifies the imagination. And so that's the one text that I want to start with, because the scripture is not inattentive to the fact that there's a process going on prenatally. We have many other examples. John the Baptist leaps in his mother's womb when Mary shows up, the cousin, and kind of a down payment on his prophetic future. These stories, metaphors, I do think vivify what we think is going on. I'm not sure what Adventists thought about abortion in 1866 when we set up our first healthcare institution, Western Health Reform Institute. Abortion was certainly practiced and much more widely in the 19th century than a lot of people think. Abortifacients were fairly easy to come by, and there were very few state laws making abortion a felony. They started to come in the middle part of the 19th century, and then by 1900 every state had made abortion a felony, largely under the influence of the now burgeoning American Medical Association. Physicians weren't happy about having abortionists doing work that they thought was bad work, and it was largely justified, the laws were justified on safety grounds. And so by the end of the 19th century, we had every state having a law on its books. I asked Ron Grable, present with us once here today, I asked him once, he won't remember this, but I do, what we should make of Ellen White's silence on abortion, because there were others in her day who were certainly not silent, and I'll give you an example in the next slide. But why nothing from her on this directly? You can infer certain things from statements made. And I don't know if I remember your answer correctly, Ron, but I think you said that you were working on trying to understand what she did say and weren't able to ascertain what she meant by what she didn't say. Words to that effect. And,
hard enough to figure out what she did say, let alone what she didn't say.
Thank you. That's a better representation of that quote. But there were others who spoke, and John Harvey Kellogg spoke with great vigor. From the very moment of conception, the processes have been in operation which result in the production of a fully developed human being from a mere jelly drop, a minute cell. I won't read all of it to you, but at the end he says, from this moment it acquires the right to life, a right so sacred that in every land to violate it is to incur the penalty of death. Well, that's actually not quite true. It wasn't true then in this land, and it wasn't true in many other lands. But he describes it as a heinous crime, and you have the reference there. In his book, I think it's the one on women's health, he describes a married woman with children who came to him asking for an abortion, and he said to her, look, this can be very dangerous. Why would you want to risk depriving your children of a mother? Why don't you just get a gun and shoot one of your existing children and then go ahead with this? That way you'll have the same number of children and you won't risk depriving them of a mother. So I don't know what you think of his bedside manner, but he told that story about himself. When Loma Linda began, as far as I know, abortion was not part of the picture here. Those of you who've been here longer than I, and especially those of you who might have been present for the initiation of the place, can tell us if you know better about the early days of Loma Linda. My first job out of school, first job for a salary, was at an office in this building. This was Portland Sanitarium and Hospital, established in the 1930s, I think, by a couple of physicians, educated here, I think, Dr. Rippey and Dr. Holden. They used to call them Hold 'em and Rip 'em, but they were a couple of surgeons who established this hospital in Portland. And my mother had surgery there in the 1940s. My office was right there. They had built a new facility right over here in the nurses' dormitory. It was right across the street. I had a keen interest in that because I had a special friend who lived there who's present here today. And I was going about my work as a chaplain in the hospital. And while I had studied biblical languages and a lot of theology, somehow they left abortion out of the curriculum. So a newly minted theology major, chaplain, and one of the doctors called me aside for a conference. Dr. Fulcher said he'd like to have a consultation. We found a little room someplace to meet, and he was clearly agitated. And had I known at the time that he was head of the obstetrics and gynecology department and a very devout Roman Catholic, I would have had a better chance of locating where to put the conversation. But what he commenced to tell me was that they were doing abortions here, which in his view, though they were called therapeutic, were not. And he showed me some cases. He got up some cases and showed me what the presenting conditions were that gave rise to the abortion, and the skin pigmentation issues and so forth. And he said, if you don't care about the fact that this is morally reprehensible, do you care about the fact that it's against the law in this state, which arguably it might have been in 1967. I went looking for, his last question stuck with me. Have you Adventist theologians said nothing about this subject? Can you show me something you've written or a statement from your church? So I went looking. And where do you look in 1967? Keep in mind that Spectrum hadn't been invented yet. The Youth's Instructor? No, sorry. Ministry Magazine? No. The Review? Sorry. I could find really nothing unless I got clear back to John Harvey Kellogg. It just seemed to be something we didn't talk about. And a leading physician from here at the time, who I asked about it later, said, well, he was the head of OBGYN here, he said, we don't have a policy. We just tell our students it's against the law and you should obey the law. Well, that was made it easy in a way, didn't it? And then something happened. The laws began to change about this time. In 1970, Washington State, Alaska, New York, actually in Washington, D.C., and the state of Hawaii all changed their laws from making abortion a felony to making it available to women pretty much on request. And this was a huge change in the law, which left Adventists unprotected by that umbrella of law. You can no longer say in those places, we just follow the law. Okay, what do we do next? So it's 1970 when this is happening. In 1962, actually, the American Law Institute had already put forward a model statute, and this was being looked at, but these laws went far beyond that model statute. It became especially interesting to Adventists because we run a facility in Hawaii. And this became a source of real controversy. Letters were flying back and forth between hospital administrators and board members, general conference leaders. What are we supposed to do now that this law no longer protects us this way, and people are demanding that we follow the law now, which is that we make abortion available. So it was a time of change. Most people don't realize, it's hard to get back into the 1960s, I suppose, in some ways, but birth control became widely used during that period. But do you know that there were still states that had laws against even talking about birth control? Connecticut had one. You couldn't get birth control in that state, and it was a crime if you made information or birth control devices available in Connecticut until 1965, when the Supreme Court struck that down in a very famous case. A case that invoked privacy as the reason for changing the law, and that principle is what became invoked again in 1973 in the very famous Roe v. Wade decision about abortion. There were lots of protests. Authority was under attack all over the nation. As is often said, that those of us who grew up in the 60s and claim to remember it probably weren't really children of the 60s, because there were a lot of other ways of protesting authority at that time. Abortion had already been liberalized a little bit in Colorado, But then the dam broke, and finally Roe versus Wade. So it was in this context that Dr. Provancha wrote the essay in 1970. And it was, at least in part, at the behest of the General Conference. Let me tell that story. By the way, I just want to touch on this briefly, but during the same period of time, in the Ministry magazine, which I have here, you're welcome to look at, in March of 1971, there were abortion guidelines promulgated, and they followed essentially the same three reasons for abortion that were given by the American Law Institute. Almost in identical words, so it was clear that the church leaders at that time were following a kind of middle road position that was similar to where the culture was going at the time. I don't think I've ever seen words like these, though, in a statement. It's recognized that these guidelines are not the final answer, but perhaps can serve at the present time. It's sort of like, we did this in a hurry, we know we need something, and stay tuned. And these had actually already been formed early in 1970, and realizing that they probably weren't the final answer, they called a committee here at Loma in May of 1970, and that's when Dr. Provancha read the paper that you have in this chapter. Near as I can tell. If it's not identical to this one, it's very close, because he published it later in 1971 in Spectrum. And near as I can tell, it's almost identical to what's here in the book. So that's the context. Change in the society, church leaders somewhat bewildered and wanting to know better answers, and they have a conference in May on this campus. These have already then come out in March, so it's kind of like which is the cart, which is the horse, because we've already put this statement out, but now we're going to have a conference at Loma to talk about whether we got it right or not. And so the article by Dr. Provancha. Main points, as I take them, and here we can talk about what you think his main points are. He starts out by likening a fetus to a tumor of the uterus, but he does that actually to make a point quite opposite of what you might expect. Is that he wants to say this is different from other tumors of the uterus. So let's talk about the difference. And it's different because the fetus has potential for personal human life. It symbolizes what we value about human life, which is the capacity to make choices, be creative, be responsible under God, to be loving people. And the symbolic value of the fetus should not be permitted to threaten the established personal life of the mother, or perhaps others. The decision about when abortion is justifiable should be shared by thoughtful members of the community. If you got all the way to the end of this, you're probably going to find some paragraphs that will make some people uneasy, because it's pretty clear that Dr. Provancha thought that, to a substantial degree, people who knew what they were talking about and were experts in the field should make the decision about whether the abortion is permissible or not. And as you might imagine, that wouldn't set well with people later. A few passages from the essay, and you can't capture the essence of the thing with just a few quotations, but let's have a crack at it. It, which he's referring to at this point as the tumor of the uterus, but the fetus, may possess positive value so strong as to warrant subjecting the mother to considerable danger in order to preserve it. So it starts out on a fairly stern note about this value that he's talking about of the fetus is very important. It's a symbol, but as I was talking it over with Dave Larson the other day, Dr. Provancha was very influenced, I think, in his use of the language about symbols by one of his mentors, Paul Tillich. And you could never say to Tillich, it's only a symbol. That's like saying, I suppose, to many Americans, the flag is only a symbol. Because for Provancha, the symbol points to a reality greater than itself, but it participates in that reality, and we respect the reality to which it points by respecting the symbol. It's a line of argument that's not entirely easy to follow for most people. You have to be able to get into his way of thinking about what it means to be a symbol, which is to say something very important. The positive value we place on the pregnancy tumor, the fetus, is based on the potential for becoming a human life, and thus the fact that it shares the worth that we ascribe to human existence. We may define man as becoming human at the instant he becomes responsible. Probably no one but an omniscient being would know the exact moment, although it probably occurs somewhere in early childhood depending on individual precocity and other variables. Potentiality for becoming human begins at the moment the normal fertilized ovum is implanted. That actually becomes kind of an important sentence going forward as well. But the idea that you become a human when you're responsible, maybe when you sign up for church membership. This is after Dr. Provancha has already gone through all the times normally named: the moment of conception, the moment of quickening or movement of the fetus detected, the onset of heartbeat or brain waves, or he keeps going till you finally get to viability, which he dwells on a bit, then live birth. But he doesn't stop at any of those places, including live birth. He says you become a human when you're responsible. Now, he acknowledges that that could lead to something you're all thinking about, and that would be the horror of infanticide. And he says that's as horrific to him as anybody else. So he's not wanting to agree to that. But I think he sees potentiality all the way through to that point of personhood, and only God knows when that happens. The more nearly the embryo or fetus approaches the conditions of being human, the higher its level of potentiality. So there's a kind of crescendo being built here toward birth and then personhood. A symbol's value is derived from that to which it points. The symbol possesses, therefore, a lesser, secondary kind of value. This means that when it seriously competes with, rather than serves, that to which it points, we must be prepared to sacrifice this symbol. I mean, in other words, it's good to place a lot of emphasis on the flag, but people do die for the flag. But if the flag's not serving the purpose it was intended for, you may need to sacrifice the flag. At least that's the way I would read it. So he's approaching the end of the arguments here. But an abortion may be performed whenever it threatens not just life, but what makes life human. It can never be right to interfere with so important a value for trivial or casual reasons. Because this involves judgment and a certain expertise, it is probable that the decision-making should be shared by a community of sensitive, informed persons, in addition to the persons subjectively involved. This is definitely not abortion on demand. This is some committee approach. And I would say that when I was a chaplain at that Portland Sanitarium and Hospital, whenever there was a case of therapeutic abortion to be performed, there was a committee of 5 male physicians who decided who could have the abortion and who not. And once again, you can imagine how controversial that would be today. Finally, coming further on, the increasingly potential human organism developing in its mother's body is not yet human, but it means human. It can serve human values by crystallizing and conditioning respect for human life. But if for some reason it should come to threaten human existence unduly, it cannot be permitted to survive. And he kind of repeats the same notion in the next passage, both on page 62. I want to just focus on that phrase, if for some reason, because that becomes later, and as you'll see in about a slide or two. So here's the schematic that's in the book, also in the Spectrum article. You have this ascending scale of values, a kind of crescendo from a thing, which I think Provancha would call ova and sperm tissue, but they don't mean human in the same way. And nobody feels too bad about losing them, but they might about embryos. It becomes a symbol once it becomes an embryo, and a potential person as time goes on, and then finally, at some time only God can know, it becomes a person. Well, the committee listened to Dr. Provancha and others. Dr. Zipberg and others made presentations, and they then added 2 provisions to the 1970 statement. That is the 1970 statement that was published in 1971. Excuse me. When the case involves an unwed child under 15 years of age, and when for some reason the requirements of functional human life demand the sacrifice of the lesser potential human value. Number 5 is, well, you notice the same language. And I asked Dr. Provancha once what he made of this, number 5 that got added. And he said, I think somebody heard my talk and didn't understand it. Well, did they understand it? They did not understand it. But what happened is, these guidelines were never published, but they were distributed to the leadership of Adventist hospitals. So you had the anomaly that you had a published statement in Ministry magazine that had gone out to all Adventist ministers and a lot of teachers, and you had a different statement with these 2 added that went out to the hospitals. But those had never seen the light of publication. And for a long time, the people who were running the Health Ministries Department apparently didn't observe that they had both statements. And it wasn't until about 1989 that the head of that department told me that they finally noticed that there were these different statements, and it was time to maybe bring things together in some coherent way. A person who's been highly critical of all of this is George Gaynor. I don't know where George Gaynor is. When he wrote this, he was a chaplain, I think, at Columbia Union College, now Washington Adventist University. But he, in a variety of places, and in this case, Ministry magazine, he has published about the history of all of this, and I must say, done a very thorough job. I have the article if you want to see it, and it's cited here. But in effect, the church has simultaneously held 2 positions. The published 1970 abortion guidelines, published in 1971, and have been presented to Adventist clergy and laity and the general public, and take a relatively restrictive stance. It's really a moderate stance. And the unpublished interruption of pregnancy guidelines have permitted its hospitals a free hand in this economically significant practice. Well, as you can tell just from those lines, Gaynor has a bit of cynicism about what's going on, and whether that's justified or not, we can talk. At the end of the 80s, and just after the Ethics Center here at Loma had started with Dr. Provancha as its founding director, and now under the leadership of Dr. Larson with us today, there was a conference on this campus, and this time, David, I did get your name on the slide. A conference in 1988 with many different points of view presented. I was invited to present there. Many other, I don't know how many essays were actually presented. And by the way, if anybody has a glass of water someplace, I can use it, but I'll keep. Oh, surely you saved my life. Thank you. Saved the morning. Thank you. I think it's my allergies getting the best of me. Just a moment. And thank you for that. You're a caregiver. This led to a book that came out 4 years later, Abortion, Ethical Issues and Options. But I have the impression, and David, you and I have spoken of this, I'm fairly sure that when the General Conference saw that convention, that conference that took place on the Loma campus in '88, it led to the establishment of the Christian View of Human Life Committee in '89. That and many other factors. But by this time, it was pretty evident that we had to talk as a church. And that book was published, by the way, and I hope we can still make it available. We're talking about ways to make these older books available. Published by the Center for Christian Bioethics in 1992, as I mentioned, with 16 of the essays in it. So there was confusion that had continued, as I say. I was asked by the General Conference to come and deliver a paper. I should have saved the letter. It would be fun to read right now. Would I come and give a paper at the General Conference on abortion and sex change surgeries? And I said, you know, I don't think I'm going to be able to do that in one paper. So you tell me which one you'd rather have. And they chose abortion, and I prepared that paper in 1979, which was later published in Spectrum in 1981. And you know, I read it again. Sometimes you write these things and you look back on them like wayward children, but because they take on a life of their own. But actually, I find myself pretty much agreeing with what I said in '81, which may just be a sign that I'm stuck in the mud or something. But I tried to lay out a principled approach with 3 principles: respect for human life, respect for personal autonomy, and a practice of fairness or justice, a balancing. Because for me, as I said in that article and have believed all of the time, is there's not just one value at stake. There are competing values, and there is a weighing process. And I want to say more about that in just a little bit. Now, that committee was, I tried my best to find a good picture of Albert S. Whiting. If anybody has one, please send it to me. This is the best I could do. Albert Whiting is one of my heroes. He was the head of the Church Health Ministries Department at the time, and a physician. And he chaired this committee. When I read the paper that I'd been asked to present there on a consensus on principles for abortion at the first meeting in 1989 at the old seminary building called Potomac University. Some of you have probably never heard of that, but our first seminary was named Potomac University, and it was there in Tacoma Park. And we met in a lecture hall like this. And the committee was having its first meeting. And we looked around and noticed, what do you think we saw about gender balance? Yep, you guessed it. There were 1 or 2 women on a committee of about 30 people. And you can pretty much work out the rest of the demographic in your imagination. And I saw Michael Jackson over there, a friend of mine who worked here as a senior executive for years. He was with Adventist Health at the time in Roseville, California. And I went over to him during a break and I said, Michael, I don't want to be on a committee like this, because even if we did good work, it wouldn't have any credibility in today's world. I would look at us. And he agreed. So I said, which one of us wants to make a motion? And I don't remember if he did or if I did, but we agreed that one would move and the other would second, and then we'd argue for it. That our first action would be that we never meet again unless they could come up with gender balance. And Dr. Whiting, who was, I think, very much in spirit in favor of this, looked even whiter than he normally looked because that motion passed. And part of what scared him was not just that he didn't want women on the committee. I think that had nothing to do with it. He didn't know how to go back to the leaders of the church and say, we're not going to be able to go forward with this committee unless you change the makeup of it. And somehow he succeeded. I don't know what those conversations were like, but every meeting after that we would count. And we did achieve a gender balance and a multicultural committee with people from all over the world. Different expertise, lawyers, and psychologists, heavily populated with healthcare professionals. Some of you remember Mary Small from here, who was a high-risk obstetrician. She was on the committee. Alan King was on the committee, also from here, another, I think, obstetrician gynecologist. And there were nurses and theologians, of course, ethicists. So it was probably the best committee experience I've had with the church, partly because of that diversity, and partly because we also agreed from the beginning that when we wrote drafts of the documents we were going to promulgate, we would send them out to all the unions of the church for comment. Now, when do you remember that happening? Here's a draft statement, like they said in 1971 in that publication of ministry. We're not sure this is the answer yet. Help us out here. What are your comments? And I think that the statement on abortion went through 8 drafts as we sent it out. Albert Whiting is a hero of mine because he was willing to go through all of that, and somehow he seemed to have the ability to make it happen. He had the courage, I think. When I first met him, I wouldn't have thought that about him, but as I got to know him, he was just a very even-keeled, fair-minded person who didn't seem to mind the controversy. So we had every conceivable position presented, including the most, the strongest possible views on different sides of this issue. And I'm sorry that says 2,000. There should be one more zero up there. And yeah, we didn't stop in 280. So out of this came the Adventist abortion guidelines that I put in your hands. I'm not going to read the document to you. It's a concern to me that that this statement, sorry, I can't hold one up, but you have it there, and if you don't have it, we have extra copies, I think. This statement is actually sometimes not widely known in the church. We use it here with our students, but I've met senior executives in Adventist hospitals and never heard of it. And we're out to change that. So pass the word. Protect prenatal life. Be gracious to those who have crisis pregnancies. Offer some practical help. How about better education of males on their responsibility, for example? And how about help to women who are in need? Limit abortion to the most serious reasons, and we spell out some without, there's a lot of argument about whether you try to make a comprehensive list, and we didn't. But we didn't also put the language of some reason. We did try to give examples. Empower the pregnant person's decision. In fact, this is the one that would probably be, I'm going to have to borrow somebody's, I guess, here, unless I have mine. Hang on. This is the one that probably would be as controversial now as it was then. Number 5. Christians acknowledge as first and foremost their accountability to God. They seek to balance between the exercise of individual liberty and their accountability to their faith community and the larger society and its laws. They make their choices according to Scripture and the laws of God rather than the norms of society. Therefore, any attempts to coerce women either to remain pregnant or to terminate pregnancy should be rejected as infringement of personal freedom. Keep in mind that at that time, and I think today, there are societies where women are virtually forced to have abortions. And what we were saying is we reject that, and we reject the idea that they're forced to remain pregnant. We've given all this counsel, but the one to decide is the one who's most affected by living with that decision. So the church should offer guidance, we said, but members should be encouraged to study and make up their own minds in light of what they find in scriptural principles. So you can read these for yourself. If what follows are a set of basic biblical principles that have shaped the thinking in this, or so it was believed by the Christian view of human life community. Now, the question I want to end with here and open the discussion is it possible to get beyond the bumper stickers? Can we lift our gaze up from only having one or the other set of values? Because you see these, you've seen these, right? And that's one side. You can pick your favorite there. And here's the other side. Against abortion, don't have one. This is what I call bumper sticker thinking. In order to carry on bumper sticker thinking, you have to minimize everything that's valuable on the other side, at great risk to your own moral integrity. To be morally mature is to realize there are a number of values that compete for our attention, and we have to live with the reality that there are times when we will have a moral dilemma. And that's not an argument between us and somebody else. It's an argument that goes on within ourselves, where we're torn. Do you ever have that? You talk to yourself, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, and then you run out of hands? Yeah, you have that argument, and the only way to resolve it with no residue of moral distress is to get rid of some values that are in fact dear to you. Am I pro-life? Firmly, resolutely, yes. I like living. I'm in favor of it. I find abortion to be a tragedy, and sometimes an avoidable tragedy. On the other hand, I'm pretty stoutly for choice. I think Adventists as a people have been very much for personal autonomy. Reasons, Ellen White says, in reasons of conscience, the soul must be left untrammeled. Old-fashioned language, but the point's the same. You get to decide. And that's very strong. That's why we publish a magazine called Liberty. So it's not just one value. And to tell a person what that person is going to do with his or her own body is to run into very sacred territory. So we need some way of balance. I call it fairness. And I would like to invite us to move beyond these. And where are we headed with this? Especially in an Adventism that may be exhibiting some unusual authoritarian tendencies lately. People have said to me, you better be careful about talking about these abortion guidelines because you might get what you wish for, a revision. And then you won't like it. And with the Supreme Court steering to the right, and you can add to this list, you know the context we live in today, a highly polarized society that pretty much doesn't seem capable of getting above the bumper sticker. And Yet I do want to tell you something that is not widely known. And I'm going to make it easy for you to find out the truth about our own policies here at Loma. I just ran across this yesterday. There's a big book, if I brought it, that Advent Health puts out. This is the big hospitals in Florida, but then they reach out across the nation, Texas and Colorado, Illinois, and so forth. They have about 50 hospitals. And this is what they tell their people. In accordance with Seventh-day Adventist theological beliefs regarding human creation in the image of God and the sanctity of life, elective abortion is prohibited in Advent Health institutions. And I think they mean it. It's the same is true for us. Therapeutic termination of pregnancy is allowable for 3 specific circumstances. It's the 3 that by now you've become familiar with. Each potential termination of pregnancy is subject to review by the duly constituted institutional ethics process. Here at our place, we require an ethics consultation. Across Advent Health, the average annual incidence of pregnancy terminations is less than 1 per 1,000 live births. Probably significantly less. So much less that some people have looked at that and say, well, you must be missing something you should be doing. And let me just make this personal for a moment, and I'll keep my promise to open this up. I have carried the beeper and done consultations in our own hospital here, and I've been called out in the middle of the night for cases like this. And just imagine this scene: a mother of 3 with her husband who is dying by bleeding to death with placenta previa. That is, those of you who know this know what I'm talking about. She's getting a unit of blood every hour or 2, and we're losing the battle. And the only way to save her is going to be to remove that uterus. They want that baby. They don't want an abortion, but they want the mother in that house. So I'm there. This is an unhappy moment. And the decision is made. She will go ahead and end the pregnancy and the life of her uterus as well, and save her own life. That was one night. Next night, about 2 in the morning, I got another call. It was my week to be on. Different scene. About a 20-year-old Hispanic young woman with her husband. First pregnancy, prima gravida, I think they say. Okay. She really wants this pregnancy. She's never been pregnant before. She has the same condition. The physician looking after her is the same one from the previous night, and she said, I've been here 11 years, and I've never seen this before, and now I have 2 cases 2 nights in a row. Same decision was finally made. Do you think anybody could walk out of that with a dry eye? I can hardly talk about it now, many years later. These are agonizing decisions, and we try to make them carefully. And we often get criticized for them anyway. But we do the best we can under what is often a tragic situation. Now, there's a new website, fairly new, AdventistBioethics.org. You can, I just took a screenshot of it. There are many resources here, including an easy way to find the Adventist Bioethics Guidelines, a policy bank that has almost 50 policies that bear on hospitals and various ethical issues. And the first one up there is abortion. So you can go and have a look, and you can read the Loma University Medical Center policy. It's just a direct reflection of the Adventist guidelines, and we do mean it. And we try to live by those. But there's nothing to hide. Sometimes the impression is left that all sorts of surreptitious things are happening. It's not true. So take a look. And by the way, we'll have our 4th annual Adventist Bioethics Conference. If you need to know more about that, let me know. We'd like to invite you to that. We'll be in Roseville, California this coming May. So where do we go? Should the 92 abortion guidelines be revised? What do you think of Dr. Provancha's essay now? Almost 50 years have gone by. And if we take Dr. Provancha's views seriously, what difference would they make today? So I'm sorry that I ran so long, but there's a lot to talk about here. And Nick, I'm not surprised to see your hand up. What do you have to tell us?
Thank you very much. I appreciate your presentation. It was quite fair. I have a question for you. The guidelines specify that the guidelines on abortion were prepared on the basis of biblical principles. So my question is, what biblical principle justify the saving of the criminal's life and executing the innocent child? What biblical principle? Please tell me. In a friend of mine, the most pro-life Adventist I know, his name is Andrew Michel. In one of his videos, he says, the abortion is the fruit, but the root of the problem is the guidelines of abortion that you help devise. Now, what can we say about the fruits? Here on this campus, there are two places. I found two plaques honoring the greatest serial killer of babies in California. And you know his name. In La Sierra, at La Sierra, same thing. Great honor. In a building, a portion of a building in his honor. In a general session, I believe it was 1990, this man who killed 250,000 unborn children, he was honored by the Adventists at the general session. I mean, this is unthinkable. I don't know what the church has to do with abortion. Let the world do the abortions. We should get out of it.
Okay. As you might guess, Nick and I have had this conversation before, and we'll probably continue to have it. What principles? I've laid them out in what I've written. I think there is a very strong biblical principle for protecting life. We can go into great detail as to what point in the development of a fetus that applies. Traditional Jewish interpretation of their own scriptures for the Old Testament do not have that applying to at the moment of conception, for example. And some of you know that biblical literature very well, and you know the traditions that have come out of it. For them, typically it's when the greater part of the body is born. Whether that's the right answer or not, we can argue about that. But as one strongly pro-life Adventist attorney said to me once, there is no text in Scripture that's dispositive, to use his word. There's not one that's going to settle it. If that were true, then serious-minded Christians would have settled this unanimously a long time ago. There's a balancing of it. So I've had my crack at it. You're right. I should own one thing that is true that you just said. I was the one who drafted those principles that were adopted in 1992. And when I look at them today, I think that they've stood up fairly well. I believe that they have not done what you say they have.
I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Winslow, for this beautiful statement. I mean, when it came out, I had the privilege of reading it back in 1992, and I just remember what a relief. And I mean, I thought, oh man, our church is really with it. I mean, this is wonderful. It's so ennobling and empowering of women, and I really do appreciate it.
Well, thanks for saying that. One of the leaders of the Christian Medical and Dental Association said to me once, I wish we had your statement.
I wish we
I wish we had your statement, because it's more reflective of the balance that we're trying to find.
And I just wanted to say that here at the medical center, what I'm about to say is years old, but they have a hard time finding nurses to take part in the OR in cases like this. But there are nurses who say, well, if the mother's life is in danger, I'm there. If it's any other reason, and they're assured, no, that's the reason. So this isn't something that's happening willy-nilly to pay for the building out here. This is not something that occurs routinely, and I can only speak for this facility. So I wanted to make that clear. I have a lot of friends who are nurses who work in the OR. Other hands. Yes.
4 or 5 minutes in. By the way, I'm willing to stay on in case anyone wants to correct me.
Excuse me.
talk more about it.
You mentioned doctors Holden and Rippey at Portland. I had an aunt that had twin aunts that graduated in the 30s in that institution. And in 1965, I had a long, deep conversation with one of them, and she stated, I believe it was Dr. Rippey stated, I can forgive a girl lots earlier for getting pregnant than for choosing to ongoingly smoke. I thought that was perceptive.
Never heard that story before. Interesting. Anyone else? The best conversations are going to happen over lunch or sometime, and I won't be there to hear them.
I'd just like to know what you think about. It seems to me that the big wastebasket was item 5 that you were listing earlier, and functionally, the wastebasket is, forgive me because I know there are at least 1 or 2 in this room, psychiatry, because that's where we talk about the mother's life being in danger from emotional distress, or I'm going to be very upset, or that kind of reason. And that's where it might be helpful to have more specific guidelines, if you will, or advice from our ethicists.
Yeah, well, if I were going to answer my own question there about Dr. Provancha, I'd say I could say a lot of things on the positive side. I think he was really wrestling with the deeply held values that many of us have. And he was finding his own way forward to balance those. His language about symbolism and its importance in this argument, conversation, is not easy for other people to follow and maybe ahead of its time. Or maybe its time never would come. I would not have stated it the way he did, and I regret the way it played out. I just have to say that plainly. And somebody said to me prior to this event, oh, poor Dr. Provancha, he's going to be talked about and he won't be here to defend himself. I am pretty sure he did not intend a liberal stance toward abortion. I'm quite certain of it. I think he was disappointed if anybody got that. But the language of for some reason, without stipulating anything more about it, I think is not helpful. And the notion of calling a 6-month-old baby not human is, you're going to have to work a long time on that to get people to understand what on earth you're talking about, and I'm not sure it's worth it, and I'm not sure it works. So in my own piece in 81, I just said this about it. I would suggest that clarity of both language and moral judgments better served by referring to life with the human genotype as human life, and the potential for that life as personal life. It's just a different way of using words. If you have a human genotype, you're probably a human life, if you're alive. And there is a potential for becoming personal. At the other end of life, you still have a human genotype, but it loses, in many cases, the capacity to be personal. And finally, in the 1960s, we developed the capacity of brain death or death by neurologic criteria, kind of recognizing that there's a crescendo that starts at the beginning and then there's something else that happens very often at the end. So for me, it would have been better to say that, that we have human life headed toward personal life, and in some cases human life that's lost that capacity.
Can I do it without the mic? Do I need the mic?
We're recording,
Okay.
but go ahead and start and we'll get it sent down.
Okay, is it
That
possible?
last one, I think.
Okay, can you run back to the presentation on the board of the 3 points of Dr. Provancha?
These are my 3 points.
Yeah, okay, right.
He has, I'm not sure if you can do his as 3 points. But,
Yeah, he had a slide on what he basically...
Well, yeah, okay. You may be thinking about
Right,
this.
yeah,
This.
the ascending scale.
Right.
Maybe for some of us who are very pro-life, we're having, you mentioned it, we're having great difficulty balancing the humanity, the value of the humanity of what we saw in the video that we began with the ascending scale of value. So where does, one thing that I notice missing in the guidelines, missing in all the presentations, is that nobody, and particularly the church, nobody has addressed how God feels about this, where he places the value on the unborn from the time of conception. So that being missing, and from Dr. Provancha's schematic there, many of us are having a hard time understanding why the very beginning of human life is kind of a throwaway because it's only symbolic. You kind of mentioned the difficulty in words, and that resonates with us. Why, and not simply the time frame, but also the manner of conception. Why does a human being conceived in rape or incest lose all value and is a throwaway if somebody decides that they don't want to keep it? Why is a human being with deformity that is unborn, why is that an optional keep, but after it's born, it's a sin? How do we reconcile Provancha's schematic with what we saw in the development of the human being as it relates to the value of what we're talking about?
I think that's a perfect expression of the question, and then we're going to find many different answers. Wouldn't it have been easier if the Bible were written like an arithmetic textbook with the answers at the end? We could just look them all up. There must be some reason it wasn't written that way, because here we are grappling with it all these years later. Let's try to do a good job of it and be honest with our own expression of the principles. We've run out of time. There's so much more that I'd like to say about that, but I'm respectful of your time, and all of you should go to church, and it'll be good for your souls. So thank you for the opportunity.